looking at the ideas that the ideas and strategies that were employed at the bridge to kind of help students move along in their journey. I guess it felt like it was a lot of trial and error. I think that was a lot of the idea behind me expressing my oh, this is design thinking, right? You have a semi-realistic, semi-controlled space where people have a lot of opportunities to kind of put things in to their lives, put strategies, schedules, activities into their lives to sort of, see what works and see what doesn't. It's like a test chamber. You're seeing how things react with each other. You're gauging the result. You're gauging how it feels for you. You're gauging how it feels for others. Your kind of end goal is creating a model for your life. And so I felt like it really connected with the idea of prototyping your life, right? You have a fuzzy idea of an end goal that you buy into and the people around you buy into, but the logistics, the design, the minute details, those haven't been worked out. Those haven't been close to being worked out. So what you start doing is you start testing ways that you think might be, conducive to getting you to that end goal, to that product that you're designing. And, that's the sort of idea of iteration, prototyping. You're putting forward designs, you're testing to see how they work in a low stakes environment. And then you're going back based off of the feedback that you've received from how it feels for yourself, from what others have told you, and you're redesigning. And I think that's where the idea of cardboard and straws came in, because I was reflecting on a class that I took in middle school where, we had to design a product. So you're building things, and this is where the idea, they gave us basically cardboard and straws. They gave us the most low stakes, cheap materials that you could to get the shapes there, they get the ideas there, and then you test it with the cardboard and straw, and it's like, oh, this doesn't look right, this doesn't feel right, this doesn't rotate right, this doesn't look the way I was imagining. These two components don't kind of work together in the way that I thought they would. But it's fine, because you didn't just spend 15 hours 3D printing something, or you didn't just spend a bunch of money on wood to laser cut it, or you didn't spend money on metal. And then slowly but surely you say, okay, well, I figured out what this shape is. I figured out what that shape is. That's going to be concrete. So then you build that shape, right? You make that permanent. And then you start putting different accessories on it. Those are, again, out of cardboard and straws. You're saying, okay, how do I build on what I'm knowing is starting to work to start fleshing it out more and more and more and more. And then as you move through the iteration process, and as you move through the bridge, you're starting to say, okay, well, I'm not going to change this. This works. Mm-hmm. But something still feels off. So I'm going to say, okay, well, maybe I'll take this gym, the time I'm going to the gym, and move it to the afternoon instead of the morning, because I'm realizing that I'm not going to the gym when I don't have a chance to sleep in. Mm-hmm. I always tend to pick sleeping in. And maybe right now that means that I need to go to sleep earlier, or maybe that means I just need to put the gym in the afternoon and accept that I might not be a morning person.
Mm-hmm. Why does cardboard and straw is a good methodology for your own improvement or the improvement you see in your peers?
I think it's that idea of the semi-supportive, right? It's a lot closer to real life than you're going to get at a lot of programs like this. And I think the challenge that I've seen in hearing about other programs that are equivalent to this, attending Wilderness, attending a much more structured therapeutic boarding school, right? Those have their purpose. But when your end goal is a life that you lead, right? It's a life that you have to design. It's something that you need to have buy-in to. And so when the bridge, we leave it vague. We leave it intentionally vague. When you're design your schedule, you have to have a certain number of hours of X, Y, and Z. We're not going to tell you when those have to be, as long as you're asleep reasonably early and you're awake reasonably early. We're not going to tell you, what those have to be, as long as they meet certain minimal criteria for constructive engagement, and it's each person can go to the bridge and have a wildly different experience. There could be very little overlap between my experience at the bridge and one of my peers or someone who's gone here before, And so when students are able to say, well, I am the one figuring out why things don't and do work for me, and I'm figuring out what does and doesn't work for me, it's not as much about fulfilling requirements, because once you no longer have the accountability mechanism for fulfilling requirements, you don't feel like you have to do them anymore. It's about figuring out, like, you become the accountability mechanism because you know how you feel when you're doing and not doing certain things.
We're talking about F words before, and like failure might be one of those F words as well, right? It's almost like, there might be, generally speaking, this sort of societal, I don't know, phobia toward failure, and that it's almost like a failure of the institution itself for the people that work in it, to protect people from failure, so that when they find themselves in these kinds of situations, nearing being independent and so on and so forth, they really don't know what to do, and they might actually be, I don't know, really anxious or panicking about, like, what happens when I make my own decisions, and like what happens if it goes wrong, and so on and so forth. So the cardboard and straws idea that you bring up has that component from my perspective. You said trial and error before. This idea that, like, inherently things are not going to work out all the time, and so part of it has to do with not only figuring out what works, but also getting used to realizing that some things don't, but that's just kind of an inherent part of the process.
Yeah, I think that, like, I have a couple of things to say, but I would venture to say that, I could make the assertion that the bridge is built on failure, and that's a really good thing, right? Like, I think, like you're saying, you have a society that has this failure aversion, and I think that's because things are getting so high stakes these days. You're going to start a company, you're going to get a high-level degree, you're going to go into law, you're going to go into medicine, or you're going to go into business, right? And there's not a lot of room for failure there, Every year matters to just get that edge, right? If you're expecting this much from kids but also telling them that they got to figure it out, there's only so many kids that are actually going to succeed. And, right now we're learning scheduling at the bridge, and that's really constructive. But I think that when you are pushing it on people and you're not giving them the support, and you're not giving them an understanding of, like, well, you got to figure this out for yourself, but we're going to support you while you figure it out, I think it leads to a lot of kids feeling left behind. And I think that that's what the bridge does really well, is it's like it lets you feel the impacts of your actions. It's like if you want to stay up late, really late, watch a movie, and then the next day you're really tired when you have to do things, that's not long-term harm. Your job's still going to be your job, like that's still supported, but you're going to feel tired, right? And the bridge, I think, that's where the cardboard and straws come in. It's like you're still sacrificing cardboard and straw, right? You're still seeing what doesn't work. You're still feeling what doesn't work. You're still getting a visualization of a life that you want to live versus a life that you don't want to live. But it's not, in the end, it doesn't have that permanence. And it doesn't have that sense of, like, this urgency that you have to be building things and you have to be getting, like, it lets you flesh things out for yourself over time in a way that does not feel like it's pressuring you somewhere.
There's a segment of the population, which you say is pretty large, I agree, that really needs a space to figure it out, because the mandates of the society they come from, they're not suitable for them. And so as long as you kind of keep on jamming that round peg in the square hole, it's just going to be frustrating. It can, like, lead to a life of frustration in a lot of ways. So, being allowed this kind of space to say, like, we trust you, like, do your thing, and like, in with guidance, we'll be really attentive to what's happening. You'll figure it out. You'll figure out your own system that actually works for you. That can and does have positive effects. But I think it's interesting that, like, I like that paradoxical nature of, the failure-oriented place, the low-stakes oriented place. I'm wondering what you've been sort of playing around with, iterating with.
One of the big steps that I had to accept for myself is that it's like I don't have infinite capacity. I think that came to a head when I was scheduling my university classes, and I scheduled, 3 2-hour classes in a row. So that was 6 hours on Monday, Wednesday, plus, 2.5 hours worth of transportation to and from San Jose. And then the next day I scheduled another 2-hour class without telling anyone. Here there's it's another concept of I guess design thinking, science, all of it. It's there's a lot higher of a volume of data collection, right? I think back to the fact that it's I know it's a pattern, but the only few concrete data points where I really have to say I took on too much and then flamed out were a few years in high school. But every year I would do the same thing because every year I thought it was a me problem, not a volume of classes problem. Whereas here I think that with the even over the course of a week I kept talking to you because you permitted me to do it. The program's not about telling people they can't do things. That doesn't mean that you didn't have your own opinion as a therapist, right? So you were kind of so I think in that week you wanted to check in more because you had your prediction of what would happen if I kept that class. And I think that prediction would have very likely come to pass. So you were much more engaged about data collection. So you're okay, how are you feeling now? I'm well, I mean, I like the class a lot, but the transportation's really hard. And then you ask me again, how are you feeling on Thursday? It's I really like the class, but that is a lot of bus rides. And it's preventing me from ever doing anything. And then the next day you're how are you feeling? It's I don't think I could sustain this,
Yeah.
It's it's giving someone the ability to come to their own conclusion by, framing their situation in the right way. Because it's I think if I were not talking to anyone about it, it would have taken me a really long time for me to bring up, touch my mic, for me to bring up to you, yeah, Danny, this class isn't working. And by then it's too late to drop the class without a penalty or anything.
Yeah, it seems like what you were just talking about is an instance of that, an instance of just learning to be a little bit more attuned to what actually works for you so that you can make those small recalibrations, I guess.
I really like riding the bus. I like figuring out how to align my schedule with public transportation because I don't have my license and stuff, so this feels very realistic to how I'd be getting around when I'm back home.
Yeah. An element of our conversation that I think is exemplified by the public transportation is this idea of dealing with uncertainty that is kind of the opposite of that path that you were talking about that's kind of laid out for you, go to this school, go to this college.
I think uncertainty has always been a big issue of mine, and I think that's why I started overcompensating with getting really rigid about all these plans, and I still think that from time to time I get a little bit caught up in oh, I thought this thing was going to go one way, it's going another, which frustrates me. But I think before it was just I could not handle change. I really hated things getting rescheduled. I really hated, plans getting canceled. I really, really didn't like uncertainty. And so that led me isolation, the only person you can really control is yourself. So I just removed almost all variables. For one, that was one of many reasons. But I think here it's been really interesting, I have been talking to people about going to college. What do you want to study? And it's well, I think it might be political science, but I'm really, really trying to be intentional about leaving doors open right now. That's the sort of thing. It's the classes that I'm taking at university right now. They are humanities, they're social sciences, but they're not all explicitly political. Some of them are sociological, and that, yes, there's a lot of them are tangentially related to the world and geopolitical stuff. But it's me broadening my horizons a lot more than what it was before. I think with the Spanish language, I think that being here has been the biggest such a huge catalyst for me to improve because it's it's cardboard and straws, and then in some places it's you got to get a little more firm with things. You have to know Spanish. But when you're exposed here to the locals, it becomes a lot less about academic Spanish and a lot more about functional Spanish. It's you don't need to know all the verbs. You don't need to know all the conjugations. You need to know how to process the fundamental idea of what they're telling you. And I think I've gotten a lot better at that, even recently. It's felt a little more exponential. Now I can hold a decent conversation. Yeah, some topics I kind of have to be we both kind of have to mutually be okay, we're not going to get to what we're trying to say there. But like I've been trying to help teach some of my coworkers some English. They've been teaching me some Spanish. It's been really, I think it's been a really impactful experience. I think that's the sort of like beauty about like Costa Rica of like I feel like it's one of the least pretentious countries that you can go to. You know, everyone here, it's like a really hardworking culture. It's a very, you know, open culture. It's a pretty humble culture, and it's like they're totally willing to say, like, this person's trying. And I think that that's one of the things that's like when you get past your judgment of yourself, you realize they don't care. They're living their lives, you know. Like I think that people assume that like people are like there's this judgment when they're trying to speak the language, and I think that yeah, you might go to some places in the world and like you try to speak their language and they're just like pretentious about it.
Yeah.
But that's not what it is here, and I think that's been really nice because it's almost a cardboard and straws culture around learning and that sort of thing, like accepting like it's like, you know, they are open to a lot of things. They're open to you struggling to assimilate to what their culture is because they know that you're trying.
Yeah.
And I hate to like do like say that I feel like the pura vida kind of idea, you know, because I feel like that's very overdone. But like that idea, I feel like I've kind of settled in to like the whole tranquilo attitude towards a lot of things, you know, and in doing so, people tell me to tranquilo a lot less.
Yeah.